introduction into the national security challenge that we've now faced for 2 decades really was on the front lines of the way the government considered the challenge back in the early 90s, which was a law enforcement problem. But regardless of whether you think of it as law enforcement or national security, the fact is that the nation was, I think, hyper-focused, myopically focused on terrorism. And I thought that it was important to try to wrestle with the fact that there is actually a deeper threat than terrorism, and in many ways a broader and more insidious one, which is the Islamist ideology that fuels not only the terrorist threat that we faced, but also this broader challenge to our society and our culture. I did that trying to be mindful of the fact that with respect to terrorism, it would have been impossible for the United States to actually make the cases and convict all the people that we convicted in the 90s and going forward, to collect the intelligence that we need to collect to keep the country safe without immense contributions from patriotic Muslims, without whom, for example, we could not have infiltrated the cell of the blind sheikh in 1993 and prevented a second plot after the World Trade Center bombing that involved trying to take out New York City landmarks like the Lincoln and Holland tunnels. So I think we have this tension. We have an ideology that we're wrestling with that I think history shows is not the universal ideology followed by Muslims in the world, but is certainly a much more mainstream ideology than we would like to acknowledge, and that we have wanted to acknowledge over the last number of years. At the same time, the type of Muslims who helped us make those cases, and the type of Muslims who I think in America in particular are in America precisely because they don't want to live in a Sharia society, are our natural allies in that battle. And I think we want to make sure that we make a policy that's sensible, but at the same time doesn't drive our natural allies away. The hardest chapter I found to write in the book was the second one, where I tried to take on the question of what should we call the challenge that we're facing? How should we think about it? And basically what it comes down to, is it Islam or is it Islamism? Do we say that Islam is simply incorrigible and it's the root of all of the evil that we face? Or do we say that while there's a mainstream ideology that's certainly traceable to Islam, that is the root of the challenge we face, we also have many, many allies in the Muslim community and we don't want to drive them onto the other side. The chapter I almost pulled out because it reads like I'm having an argument with myself. I left it the way it was because I am having an argument with myself. I've been having it for about 18 years, and I think anybody who tries to grapple with this in a serious way is going to find that they're having an argument with themselves as well. Well, we're fortunate this morning to try to take on that question with two of the real great patriots in the United States who've been really at the forefront of the ideological battle, which is probably the most important battle that we face in confronting radical Islam and trying to defend our country. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy and was an officer in the United States Navy. Robert Spencer, of course, needs no introduction to this group. He's the director of Jihad Watch, an indispensable project of the indispensable David Horowitz Freedom Center, and a best-selling author. So I want to begin by putting on the table the question, Islam or Islamism? Zuhdi, it's often said that there are many, many moderate Muslims. But the fact that we have moderate Muslims doesn't necessarily mean that Islam is a moderate doctrine. And we have people like the president of Turkey who actually get themselves pretty whipped up by terms like moderate Islam, He famously has said, you know, Islam is Islam and that is that. Where do you come out on that?
Thank you, Andy, and Robert, it's nice to be with you. Yeah, I think this is the million-dollar question, is how do we define who our enemies are and who our friends are? Do we allow their terminology to guide what we define as the terms, and how do we figure this out? I guess my first question back to you would be, one of the suppositions in your question is that, well, most Muslims are moderate, but yet, you know, the faith may not be. So how did these Muslims turn out that way? Was it by accident, or how was it over time that they came to, like my family, want to come to countries like this to be free and escape some of the oppression that they lived in? And I think, you know, people like Turkey's president and others, the Imam, clearly we have a crisis in leadership. Clearly we have a doctrinal crisis also, in that much of what is put forth by leaders within our community that are theologians have been arrested over time, basically in the 13th, 14th, 15th century, and has not gone through a continued modernization. And many of the things that you'll hear us talk about today, and that Robert and others talk about, are truly beliefs and theology that is put forth as Islamic law by many imams and scholars, or ulama as we call them, that the community, or the tribe, if you will, wherever tribal mentality exists, defers to. But yet there's a schizophrenia to it, in that many in our community, I mean, I know my parents and others, I have yet to meet Muslim parents that would be proud of their kids to go to become an imam, or to become a theologian. So therefore, that's a schizophrenia, I think, in that yet they want them to be doctors and lawyers and engineers and PhDs and others, but yet going into religion is not looked upon as a very respectful thing, but yet they go to mosque and they listen to the imam, they disagree with a lot of what he says, and they don't say anything. They're the silent majority. So in many ways, they're responsible for the problems we have, absolutely. But is there a moderate Islam? I don't know. I think that's why I'm doing the work I do. I believe there is. I think that if Islam taught violence and taught radicalism, I think one of the things I would ask you to look at this question is, as historians, if Islam in 14 centuries taught violence and terrorism, would the world exist the way it exists today? Clearly, political Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood, especially from the early 20th century and all of its radical offshoots, is a phenomenon of the 20th century. Take away that 20th century, you have before that 400, 500 years of the Ottomans, which basically ossified any type of reform. And I would say one of the scholars that I find, I think, the most erudite and on the money on this issue is Bernard Lewis. And if you read his book about what went wrong, and you look at history, there's no doubt that there was 600-700 years of Islamic history in which there was a moderation of thought. Now, is that compared to America? Absolutely not. I wouldn't want to live in 13th century Spain. But yet, if I was alive at the 13th century, in many Jewish texts, it's considered the golden age of Judaism at that time. Maimonides did his great work, etc. So if Islam was immoderate as a faith, the evolution of Islamic society at the time would not have been the way it was. And we have to be careful in what comparisons. If we compare 13th century Spain to America, that's an oppressive, almost apartheid type society. But compared to the Dark Ages in Europe and what existed at that time, I think that it was a moderating society that was going through a natural evolution. So, you know, I would say that ultimately we as Muslims need to go back and figure out how to continue the work that started to die off in the 13th, 14th century and begin to create new schools of thought that are outside of the current boxes that we're fixed into, to create new theology so that we don't abandon what it is to be Muslims. Because when I teach my kids about Islam, if I see, you know, if we start getting into the narrative that Islam is immoderate, what am I going to be teaching my children? How am I going to allow them to identify in that relationship with God if the message is that Islam is immoderate? And it depends on who's Islam. I've written some papers on which Islam and who's Islam. I'm not in denial, like most Muslim Brotherhood groups, that bin Laden is not practicing Islam, or like the president of Turkey is. Clearly that is a version of Islam that we need to counter. But we can't give them the mantle of Islam. We need to have that civil war within the faith to allow moderation, to allow ideas of liberalism to get into the faith, so that we can see a new version, a moderate version, a westernized secular liberalism get into the ideology of Islam to make that happen and consistent with Western society?
Let me turn to Robert. I take it from what Zuhdi is saying, two possibilities on the table. One is that the doctrine is actually more moderate than might appear from some of the more belligerent verses in the scriptures. The other possibility is the doctrine is what it is, but there are other pressures that a society can put on doctrine, like cultural aspects of a society, that are in some cases better at reining in a doctrine that has some dangerous tendencies than other cultures are. What do you think?
Well, that's exactly it, Andy. The question before us that you originally posed was about Islamism or Islam, and Islamism is actually an artificial construct that doesn't exist in the Islamic world. It's certainly true that we shouldn't let people who are misrepresenting the case define the terms for us, but we have to understand what the situation really is if we're going to undertake any genuine reform or even come up with any kind of cogent or compelling solution to the problems that we face. And so, for example, you know, Dr. Jasser says that the Muslim parents don't want their children to become imams, and there's a reason for that, because Islam does teach a violence and radicalism at the core that is embedded in the Quran, embedded in the teachings of Muhammad, that many Muslims obviously don't want to partake of in their lives, because human nature being everywhere the same, people are people, they want to have a job and raise their family and live a life, and they don't want to be bothered with strapping on a suicide vest and killing people and so on. And so they keep a distance from Islam as it is officially codified, and they live lives in accord with generally more Western values. But the question is, what exactly is it that Islam does say? And that is something that is readily verifiable from the sources of Islam. The question of what is Islam cannot be defined by Spencer or by Jasser or by Osama bin Laden. The question of what Islam is defined by what Islamic groups throughout history have used to define it, and that is the Quran and the teachings of the Muhammad, the teachings of the various schools of Islamic jurisprudence, which have been fixed since the 9th century. And there is no sect or school of jurisprudence in Islam that is recognized as orthodox that does not teach that the community of the Muslims worldwide has the responsibility to wage war against unbelievers and to subjugate them as inferiors, depriving them of essential rights under the rule of Islamic law. That is a universal that is taught among all the sects and schools. And so to your question, would the world exist today as it does if Islam did teach violence and radicalism? Well, I think, yeah, that's the world we live in. And that there have certainly been periods in which the Islamic world did not wage war against unbelievers with the fury that we're seeing now. But that was not because of a change in the teachings of the various sects and schools or any rejection of Muhammad's imperative, which he said, I've been commanded to fight against people until they confess that there is no God but Allah and I am his messenger, or the Quranic imperative to subjugate the people of the book and make them pay the jizya, the tax, specified for non-Muslims in chapter 9, verse 29. These things are indeed taught and always have been. But there have been periods in history when, for various reasons, for humane reasons or for reasons simply of military or societal weakness, these things were not pursued. However, we also have to be careful not to overstate that case. Muslim Spain was not really a paradise of proto-multiculturalism. Maimonides, whom Dr. Jasser mentioned, actually complained bitterly about the yoke of the Ishmaelites, that is, about the oppression that the Muslims had placed the Jews under. And he escaped when he could. The reality of the situation was very hard for the Jews and Christians in Muslim Spain. They never had equality of rights with the Muslims, and when a Jew was actually placed in a position of authority, which is in contravention of Islamic law, which mandates that the Jews and Christians have a subjugated status and never hold authority over Muslims. When in the year 1066 in Granada in Spain, a Jew was placed in authority by a Muslim ruler who had a more humane outlook. The Muslims in the city rioted, and 4,000 Jews were killed in a pogrom because they understood that what he had done was in contravention of the laws of Islam, which they considered to be the laws of the eternal God, which could not be broken. And so the problem here that is before us is indeed embedded within Islam itself. Osama bin Laden and the others today make their appeal to peaceful Muslims on the basis of Islamic authenticity. They claim for themselves the mantle of the true teachings of Islam. Now, I'm not saying, and never have said actually, in any of my books or articles or anything, that they do represent the true Islam. But it is undeniable that they claim to, and that they make converts to their point of view on that basis, by appealing to the Quran and appealing to Muhammad. And so the question of what is Islam and what is the way to reform has to tackle that head on, and to offer an alternative vision of the Quran and Muhammad that actually realistically confronts their construction of these materials and explains why it is that it must be rejected, instead of simply wishing it away or pretending that it were otherwise.
Well, let me ask Zuhdi to react to that. In your work as a reformer, what is the rationale for trying to marginalize the doctrines, or at least the scriptures that are unquestionably in black and white in the doctrine, that feed the radicalism?
Yeah, I mean, you know, listening to Robert, it reminds me of when I was chief resident at the Naval Hospital, these physicians that came, some of them had great board scores and they aced the tests, but yet they couldn't treat a patient because they couldn't tell when a patient was sick or ill. And, you know, you have some of the data right, but I think that you've not, you know, you're not a Muslim, you've not necessarily been impacted by Muslims that love their faith or are spiritual or understand their scripture in a way that is non-threatening, and you've basically been taking a lot of the doctrine and ideologies out of certain theologians and allowing that to become what is Islam. And as historians and as human beings and as human anthropologists, if you will, when you study a religion, you need to study its people and study how it acts the way it is. And I think one of the things that's really, I think, incorrect as a scientist and as a historian is to, on the one hand, criticize Spain for being undemocratic, which I never said it was, but yet ascribing 21st century American principles to 13th century Spain when you can't, you need to keep yourself in the context of the time. So when we argue about Spain, we need to argue where in the world, if Islam was so backwards and Christianity was so advanced, what was going on in history in the 13th century that it took the West 1776 years, actually 1789, until we actually had a legal system that talked about render unto Caesar what is Caesar and unto God's what is God's. And why would Islam not have the same type of evolution? And why would we hold the Muslim people accountable to a completely different set of values that is somehow cherry-picked out of history as we discuss it today, and somehow we say that that is the recipe? And I would ask each and every one of you, whatever faith you believe, Judaism, Christianity, whatever your faith is, at the end of the day, when you decide your own relationship with God, how often do you personally defer to your imam or your priest or your rabbi? How often do you personally defer to your legal system when you actually feel what is right or wrong? And if you don't do that, if you don't defer to the leaders of your community, and you make your own mind up, are you then an uninformed, ignorant Jew or Christian? As we're hearing Robert say, that Muslims that really don't do that, they just sort of adopted Western values and don't really understand their faith. They're basically ignorant nominal Muslims who seem to somehow be deluded into some spiritual path that they're calling Islam, but is really not Islam. Even though when I do my prayers, I'm citing scripture. I've asked I try to understand what the meaning is. I've questioned my parents and my leaders that thought they knew what they were talking about and challenged them on these passages. So I basically use the faith that I believed, that I grew up learning. It wasn't politicized. When I went to the University of Wisconsin, I finally started to learn about the MSA and the brotherhood groups. And had I not grown up in a small town, I think had I grown up in a more ghettoized community, whether it be Dearborn or LA or wherever, where you may have been influenced as a youth, I may not have turned out the way I did. But at the end of the day, I believe I'm an intellectual, and why would I be an intellectual in medicine and not apply the same things to religion? And why are so many educated Muslims being discarded as being ignorant or not being able to challenge their imams simply because they haven't had the stimulus to do this reform work? So I would say you know, if we are students of history, you know, why are we discarding scholars like Bernard Lewis, which I'd love to hear what Robert's vision is of Dr. Lewis's work, who the Wall Street Journal just interviewed in depth a few days ago. And you know, if you look at historians like this and you look at the Muslim community, and actually I would disagree on the other point, is that Muslims have identified, if you go to the Middle East, the Islamic movements are called Islamiyyin in Arabic. It is clear in Syria, where my parents came from, the brotherhood groups, the political Islamists, are called Islamists in Arabic. They're not called as practicing Islam. There are many Muslims that are devout Muslims that don't belong to these Islamic movements, don't want Islamic political parties, and actually when the French pulled out of Syria, a lot of the community that my parents knew did not want Islam in government and actually wanted that separation, and much of what is called Sufism is actually a big part of the spirituality of Islam, is actually Islam on the ground. So,
Zuhdi, let me ask you something though about a couple of things about real world experience. When I tried the blind sheikh, we had a lengthy defense case, and a number of authentically moderate Muslim people came in to testify. And every now and then during the course of the testimony, a question of Islamic doctrine would come up. What does jihad mean? What is zakat? And at least 3 times, these authentic moderate people, when asked a question like that, would say, I wouldn't be competent to answer that. You'd have to ask, and they would turn to the homicidal maniac who was in the corner of my courtroom. And I don't want to. I want people to understand the task of reform that you're up against. I mean, we've heard for several weeks now that there's an Arab Spring of democratic uprisings in the Middle East. We got a real snapshot a couple of weeks ago, the referendum in Egypt, where, you know, to be honest, the secular progressive Democrats that we've heard about for 6 weeks got wiped out by a margin of about 77 to 23. What is that? Taking everything you're arguing as true, how mainstream is the Islam that you're talking about in the greater Muslim world?
I think you've hit on my main problem.
Right.
At the core, is that when we just had a Liberty Project where we brought in Muslims from all over the country, about 25, 30 kids and some of their parents, and they came in, and the main skill we're teaching them is actually not countering some of these ideas, because it's too early for that. The main skill we're teaching them is critical thinking. Is that the crisis that we have in the Muslim community and many of the communities is critical thinking, is challenging leaders, and actually it's not only the imam, challenging their parents. Is that part of the enlightenment of the West that I think many of us in America take for granted, is this process that created the American Revolution started long before 1776. It was an enlightenment process in which existential philosophers and many philosophers started to create new ideas, either related to religion, unrelated to religion, and they challenged orthodoxy, they challenged the establishment, and this concept of the individual taking precedence over the group was a huge part of the revolution of the West. And that if you benefit the individual, you ultimately benefit the group. This concept is very foreign to even Muslims that are here. And they don't even, that's what we're trying to teach them. And I think that through that vehicle, we teach them, yes, you need to respect your parents, but challenge them and question them. And we use Quranic passages in which God tells Muslims, if your parents tell you not to believe, respect them, but don't follow them. You know,
well,
so
let me ask Robert about the tradition of self-examination in Islam. The concept is, I think, ijtihad. Am I right about that?
Well, it's not really self-examination. Ijtihad is evaluating the Islamic texts, the Koran and the teachings of Muhammad, to formulate a legal opinion, a ruling on a disputed question. And actually, it's mainstream in Islamic thought that what is termed the gate of ijtihad closed about 1,000 years ago, that there were various legal scholars who were uniquely endowed in knowledge of the Islamic texts and able to come to independent judgments about these various questions. And they were the ones who formulated the great Islamic schools of law, the Sunni schools, the Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanafi, and Hanbali schools, which essentially codify Islam for most of the Islamic world. And this is all something that happened a millennium ago, and now it's considered that the idea of independent thought is illegitimate in itself and constitutes bid'ah or innovation, which is to be discouraged because Muhammad said, my community is not to agree on an error, and consensus or ijma is something that is valued very highly among the various legal scholars, so that something that they agree upon is considered to be settled, and then one ventures into heresy or apostasy by questioning it, and that can get you killed. And so the problem here is that Dr. Jasser was saying that, well, you know, I'm not a Muslim, and so I must not really know anything about this. That's a needless mystification that actually kind of prescinds from any discussion we could really have about this at all. Anybody can read the Quran, anybody can read the Hadith, and anybody can know can observe what's happening in the Islamic world. And what happens in the Islamic world is that genuine reformers like Mahmoud Muhammad Taha in Sudan in 1985, who posited that the Meccan verses of the Quran, which are generally more tolerant and peaceful than the Medinan verses, which mandate warfare against unbelievers and their subjugation, should take precedence. Whereas in mainstream Islamic theology, as settled long before the gate of ijtihad was closed, the Medinan verses take precedence, and the violence is something that's mandated for all time, whereas the peace and tolerance is not. Well, hold on just a second. Taha was executed for heresy by the Sudanese government, and so the point is that this kind of thing is not an easy discussion to have. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be happening or that we should not encourage genuine reform, but we have to do it open-eyed and realistically with a genuine assessment of what the prospects really are and what the situation really is,
but
not
Robert,
kid ourselves
Robert,
about it.
Let me ask you this, because I think you're hitting on something Zuhdi's actually saying, which is, you just said yourself, anybody can read the Koran, anyone can read the scriptures.
Yeah.
And then you also then brought attention to what the interpretation of those scriptures is, what, you know, abrogation, whether the Meccan verses are overruled by the Medina and so on. But doesn't that mean that there is an ability for people in a critical fashion to read the doctrine and interpret it for themselves?
Oh, without any doubt.
And that maybe it's possible to marginalize these interpretations. I'm not saying it's not an uphill battle, but that it's
I would say it's theoretically possible, sure. It's also theoretically possible that one day we'll have colonies on the moon and live there and harvest green cheese. But the question is, what is the likelihood of it? And that has to be based on what the possibilities really are on the ground in the Islamic world. When people like Taha are executed for venturing outside the mainstream Orthodox interpretations of the sources, then we have to, and this is not an isolated incident, this is true. Suleiman Bashir was a Quranic scholar in the West Bank at the University of Nablus, and he posited to his students that the Quran, instead of being delivered in perfect form through the angel Gabriel to Muhammad, and is a perfect copy of the perfect eternal book, he posited that it was a product of historical development. His students got up and threw him out the window. So this kind of violence indicates that not only do the Salafis, the pure ones, the Muslims who are hardline and teach this kind of violence and hatred, not only are they claiming for themselves the mantle of Islamic authenticity, but they will kill you if you stick your neck out too far against it.
Zuhdi,
so
let me let
one
Zuhdi
other
respond.
thing. The question is, will Islam undergo, why can't Islam undergo the same evolution as Christianity did and as the West did in the Enlightenment? Well, obviously, theoretically it can, but we have to grapple also with the fact that the sources teach different things. And the Judeo-Christian tradition of the dignity of the human person and the equal dignity of all people before God simply does not have parallel in Islam, which teaches, for example, in the Quran, Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. Those who follow him are merciful to one another, but harsh or ruthless to the unbelievers. This dichotomy between the believer and unbeliever characterizes all Islamic tradition and makes it very hard to establish a society in which all people are treated with equal dignity. And that's still not the case today, as we can see with the massive persecution of Christians by Muslims who claim Islamic authenticity around the Islamic world. As you can see
let me let Zuhdi react to that and ask specifically, is there one Islam, or is there in fact different Islam in different places? I mean, we have places like Indonesia that has a different Islamic tradition, for example, than, say, Egypt. Are we talking about a situation where we can expect one big global battle over what the true Islam will be, or are we going to see, at least hopefully, an evolutionary development that'll be different in different places?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, again, we're applying ahistorical discussion. As I'm listening to Robert, it's almost ahistorical about, you know, he's bringing examples of assassinations of reformers and things like that, and it's almost as if we, you know, the assassin that killed the reformer was somehow somebody that truly understood Islam, and that's why he was an assassin, when we forget about the fact that the countries that these happen in are basically mostly countries that have been driven by two fascisms. One is secular fascism, as we see in the Mubarak type Egypt, the Saddam Husseins, the Hafiz Assads, the Bashirs of the world, etc. These fascists have developed communities. You know, people say that, well, the Brotherhood is the only group with an infrastructure in Egypt, and they've not asked, well, why is it in a oppressive autocracy under from Jamal Abdel Nasser on, the Brotherhood has been the only group with an infrastructure? A lot of it has to do with its method of function, but it also has to do with the fact that these fascists allowed radical Islam to flourish in their environment, because it created a boogeyman that they could then use to impose martial military law upon their societies, and the true moderates have continuing to be extinguished since these dictators have been created and created themselves in the environment that they exist. So if we're going to counter that and reform that, both fascisms, I think, have to be countered. And that's why our whole forum is based on creating a third pathway for Muslims, so that secularism isn't looked upon like dictatorship is looked upon, and they look upon it as a pathway of moderation. Indonesia is a great example in that this is actually a country that was never under Muslim rule, but yet is the largest Muslim population country. And there's a group called Lib for All, which was founded by President Wahid. He now has a book coming out called The Illusion of the Islamic State. It was in Indonesian for quite a while. Now it's coming out in English in the next few months. We're going to be working with them on the rollout of that in May. And basically it talks about how the most, I think, spiritual Muslims, and he talks about this, are those that don't believe in the Islamic State. In fact, it is an illusion of theocrats. And these concepts can exist in Islam. Reformers, yes, have been challenged, and that's why we have to do the work I'm doing and others are doing in America. Because the environment in those countries right now, most of the Muslim majority countries, is that way, yes, somewhat because of theocratic fascism, but also because of corruption, because of illiteracy being over 50%, because of secular fascism, blind Arab nationalism, anti-Semitism, all these kinds of propagandistic ideologies that have just destroyed our communities, has to be fought, I think, and one of the main ways, and at the end of the day, what's the solution? One of the primary ways to solve these pathologies is through God, through a spiritual reverence to whatever our pathway is. And if these countries are going to get rid of corruption, and Muslims are going to do that, I think one of the ways has to be through spirituality. If you take away the concept of Islam, what do you leave them with? Either you're going to convert a quarter of the world's population, or you're going to create a wall around America, which I think ultimately we can't do economically. So what is the solution that saying that it's, you know, green cheese and the moon, whatever the sarcasm was, at the end of the day, you know, you have to figure out a solution that's going to work.
Well, let me ask you about, let's try to move to solutions, because I think clear from what you're saying and clear from what we've experienced is that we have to have a way to separate out who the real moderates are from the false moderates who have been allowed to sort of exist under the radar screen because we've been so hyper-focused on terrorism that we're missing a big element of what we call political Islam, or I guess it's now called kinetic Islam, is that right? A number of us, and I've been involved in this project myself, have said that we need to move our barometer from terrorism to Sharia, because it's a more clear dividing line between those who want to impose not only the spiritual elements of Islam, but the more comprehensive political system and economic system and military system and so on. That there are Muslims who take Sharia, however they take it, to be a personal guide to how they live their lives, but don't want to impose its comprehensive system on the rest of society. And that those are the real moderates. And then there are others who say they may not want to blow up a building to get this done, but they actually do want to see the United States Constitution supplanted by their view of Sharia. The problem I see for you, and I'd like you to react to this, is the reason I think that's an effective test is you can lay out some basic elements of Western liberalism. The idea that people have a right to make law for themselves, equality, freedom of conscience, privacy, so on. And say that these do not jibe with Sharia. If that's an effective test, what does that say about Sharia?
Yeah, I think, this is ultimately, what is the pathway that Muslims can be looked upon as, how do we determine who's moderate and who's not? And I think ultimately that's why our organization's principles, terrorism, as I mentioned in my testimony at the King hearings and radicalization, that is that last final stepway, that pathway to that last final step. And it's a long process. Nidal Hasan, let Homeland Security and the FBI figure out the future Nidal Hasan those last few days before they commit that act, and the sting operations, etc. That's not where I can help you. Muslims like me can help you years before, where Nidal Hasan was growing up in a house in which his parents told him everything was a Zionist conspiracy, everything was against the West, this government's against you, it's against Muslims, Islam is the solution for everything. All of these supremacist type concepts, propagandistic concepts, even groups like, that are part of the Brotherhood legacy groups in America, they use the victimization mantra because A, it collectivizes Muslims, and B, is part of the narrative to say that Islam is the enemy of America, and they feed into that. So if we're going to counter that, we have to break it not only from its beginning, but from its core ideologically, which is through, I believe, the separation of mosque and state. If we can teach Muslims that ultimately Sharia has no place in government, ultimately that government should be based in reason, not based in what they call Sharia. One of the things when we talk to youth is we say, okay, call it Sharia if you want, but then is it Sharia? Because Sharia is God's law according to Muslims, just like Talmudic law is to Jews. And yet, if it's put into place by man, or man and women, then is that really God's law? It becomes man's law. So once we convince them of that, they are inoculated against ever an imam telling them that they need to replace. I saw at the Islamic Society of North America, Siraj Wahaj stand up in 1995 and say he wanted to replace the US Constitution, which was a man-made document, with this document from God, which is the Koran. I stood up then in front of everyone and told them that that was sedition and that I would never participate in anything related to ISNA again. But at the end of the day, the argument against these imams is that it is not God's law when it's interpreted by man, and that we can worship God no matter whether we have rights or not. I mean, Izbegovic has a book about Islam called Islam Between East and West, in which he says he was never more Muslim than when he was in solitary confinement. So as I talk to youth, I say, if that's true, then you don't need government for your faith. You don't need any rights for your faith. And you need to be able to separate mosque and state and base law based in reason. And one example I want to give is alcohol. I don't drink as a Muslim, but yet most Muslims I've talked to believe that that's part of our Islamic law, but don't want that in government. They want it to be a choice. They want God to be able to see that they've made that choice. And if Muslims can do that, then they agree that Sharia has no place in government.
Well, I don't drink as a Muslim either. As a non-Muslim, but let me turn to Robert in all seriousness. Sharia, separation of mosque and state, prospects?
Oh, well, I'm all for it. I'm actually the associate director of a group called Stop Islamization of America, which is dedicated to separation of mosque and state. That is, to resisting the encroachments of Sharia in the United States, the stealth jihad, the nonviolent attempts to bring Sharia here. But there's no denying that these people who are trying to bring Sharia here believe that it is God's law, and that one is deviated from Islam by resisting Sharia and resisting the spread of Sharia however it's done. Even Izbegovic, that Dr. Jasser just invoked in regard to speaking about the separation of mosque and state, the guy who said that he was felt most Muslim in solitary confinement, well, I wish he'd stayed there, because he actually wrote the Islamic Declaration for the Balkans and did his best to establish an Islamic state. He didn't believe in separation of mosque and state at all. His Islamic Declaration is a manifesto for establishing establishing an Islamic state, first in the Balkans where he was, but also around the world, all the way through to Indonesia, where there again, it's not a model of reform either. Christians have been violently persecuted in Indonesia for their faith, denied the right to build churches. Churches that have been deemed to be without permits have been burned in accord with traditional Islamic laws, forbidding non-Muslims to build new houses of worship or to repair old ones, but to live in a state of subjugation. The people who do these things, and the people who killed Taha and threw Bashir out the window, who I mentioned before, and Dr. Jasser said that, well, they didn't. I'm assuming that the assassins truly understood Islam. I'm not actually assuming that at all. The assassins were assuming that. They were claiming to truly understand Islam, to be representing Islam when they did what they did. It is not ahistorical to criticize Islamic law as a product of the 13th and 14th century when it is the Islamic supremacist groups that are trying to bring that law to the 21st century. They are the ones who are being ahistorical and anachronistic. But see, the problem in sum is this. We do need solutions, and we do need to have an honest and open discussion about what solutions are viable and what are not. But our quest for solutions so far, after 9/11, has led the United States government to take many, many Muslim individuals and groups as moderates who are not moderates. Siraj Wahhaj, whom Dr. Jasser mentioned as wanting to replace the U.S. Constitution with Sharia and a caliphate, he's actually also the first Muslim to give an invocation before the U.S. Congress because he was deemed a moderate. And everybody was in such a rush to find solutions that they were insufficiently critical and insufficiently attentive to what exactly makes a moderate. Is a moderate just somebody who's not blowing something up right now? Or is a moderate somebody who is actually confronting the sources of Islamic radicalization that the radicals themselves explain are in the Quran and the Sunnah? We have to confront that. And I am all for modernization, for reform, for a real opening of Islamic thought. But that cannot be done without assessing what it is that's causing the problem in the first place. And that's really all I'm contending.
Robert, can I ask Robert a question?
Yeah, of course.
How do you foresee, what is your solution if the Prophet's demonized, if Islam is demonized as a faith? How do you get a solution out of that?
Well, what is demonization? Is it demonization if I quote Muhammad and I quote him when he says, "Be sure to collect the jizya because that's the source of your livelihood"?
You're not answering my question.
Well, actually, I am answering your question. The question is how can we proceed if we're demonizing Muhammad? I don't think it's demonizing Muhammad to quote his violent and supremacist statements about subjugating the Jews and making war against the Jews and Christians and so on. And so, if he said those things, if he's believed to have said those things, then obviously there has to be formulated some new understanding of him as the excellent example of conduct, as the supreme guide for behavior. But instead of pretending that he didn't say these things and was actually somebody who taught peace and tolerance like Karen Armstrong's fictional Gandhi-like Muhammad. The real Muhammad from the Quran and the Hadith, he did say these things. And so I reject in the first place the premise of the question. It's not demonizing him to say that he's doing these things, but how are we going to deal with that if he did?
I'm going to use the moderator's privilege. Zuhdi, what do we do about Muhammad and the example of Muhammad?
Well, I mean, I think this is central to reform. Is at the end of the day, we can't even decide what happened in Afghanistan 2 years ago in certain episodes of battles, let alone figure out 620 AD and 625 AD. So, at the end of the day, I would say to figure out which Muslims are on our side is whatever mythology, call it mythology if you will, the mythology that we develop of what we believe those stories that happened at the time of the Prophet Muhammad, whether it's the Battle of Uhud or whatever battle that happened, that mythology needs to be compatible with today's society. But to say that somehow, every prophet to a Muslim is thought to be one of the best examples of man, whether it's Abraham or Moses, just as it is. Imagine trying to reform Judaism by saying that, well, Abraham had periods in which he was a radical barbarian and beheaded people wantonly. I mean, you can't reform a faith in which we know that the God of Abraham had chosen. I mean, this is, to us as Muslims, the Prophet Muhammad was chosen by God to reveal a message. Now, was he pacifist? Absolutely not. There were battles. Do we need to look at those stories and figure out how to get truths out of them, to address the things that the Wahhabists and the Salafists especially use. Absolutely, I think all these things need to be addressed that Robert appropriately brings out. But he also, by ascribing it to truth, there are hadith. A lot of what he gets are from hadith, discussion of the Prophet. I believe in many Muslims, much more so I think than Robert would care to admit, think that those are garbage. The Prophet never said such a thing. Those pieces of history
are considered authentic.
Okay, that's exactly it. The people that consider authentic are tribal war leaders that came out of Pakistan, came out of Afghanistan, came out of. I can show you derivations. Okay, so this is the issue: is that there's been a control of the intellectual domain of Islam that has been centralized in Al-Azhar University in Saudi Arabia and propagated by petrodollars, and we need to create alternative narratives to start to marginalize the radicalism. But to say that the Prophet was a pedophile is not going to work among Muslims for reform.
Right, well, now that we've achieved complete agreement on that, let me ask these two great patriots to sum up. And what I'd ask you in this regard is, where do you see us 5 years, 10 years from now? Start with you, Zuhdi.
Yeah, I think that's the great question is you know, what's the trajectory? We are not going to solve this problem in 5 years. You know, my family talks about the fact that 2 generations of Assad has basically destroyed the Syrian community. So it'll take probably 2 generations to rebuild that. But I think in today's media, you can rebuild things a lot more quickly than it took. And remember what created the West. There was a 30 years war, a 100 years war. There was a lot of bloodshed in order to create this wonderful society that we had and reform and counter theocracy. And I think similarly among Muslims, we need to create institutions before we create nations. There needs to be liberal institutions that have an Islamic identity. This can't be done from the outside in. It has to be done internally, organically, from within the Muslim community and within an Islamic consciousness, so that we not only, and I think you first build a foundation of liberty, and this is why our Muslim kids that came last week, we gave them Bastiat's The Law, Hayek's Road to Serfdom, we gave them Bernard Lewis's book, What Went Wrong, and then also some texts on Islam and the secular state and things like that. But you have to build the foundations of liberty, because 99% of who I was as a Muslim I knew before I could have had any of the discussions I have now. It was part of what was right and wrong, my superego, all of this was part of my faith long before I knew who Ibn Taymiyyah was and Ibn Kathir and all these people that Robert has become an expert in. But yet when you look at most Muslims, I think ultimately we need to give them alternatives. As you build alternatives, and hopefully you can help us do that at the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and allow us to build alternatives for Muslims so that they will no longer be sucked into brotherhood legacy groups that want to collectivize Muslims. And it won't happen in 5 years. And this is the other thing that I think that's really important. Domestic policy is exactly the same issue as foreign policy. So when we try to compartmentalize things and say, well, Egypt, we need this policy, in Yemen, we need this one, in Syria, domestically, it's different. It's one issue: Muslim reform, separating mosque and state, building institutions that if we build them here, we can then take these ideas, translate Road to Serfdom to Arabic and get it into schools in the Middle East, and translate Jefferson's papers on religious freedom into Arabic and get them into Muslim communities. And slowly, I think we are going to take some steps backwards in the Middle East in the next 5 years. Countries like Libya may end up getting influenced heavily by the Brotherhood. But does that make what we're doing against Gaddafi wrong? Absolutely not. You cannot go anywhere. There is an illusion of security right now, because these dictators have been transmitting anti-Semitism and hate and Islamism in their societies. So either we say that somehow they're going to continue to oppress their communities forever, or that somehow there needs to be an avenue towards modernization. The first step is to change those governments, as many in the neoconservative movement had talked about in the freedom agenda. And then as you do that, get our hands dirty in helping institutions like we did in Eastern Europe after Poland and Czechoslovakia and Romania and all these countries changed. Those were success stories. It's more difficult in the Middle East, but I think it can be done.
Thank you. Robert?
It's all happening so quickly, but it's all happening in one direction. We heard over the last few months how wonderful it was that Egypt and Tunisia were throwing off these dictators and establishing genuine Western pluralistic secular democracy. And almost immediately, and I was warning all through that actually the Salafist groups, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamic supremacist pro-Sharia groups were the ones that were going to take over. And I was on show after show on Fox, and they said, oh, no, 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 you're fear-mongering. Juan Williams said to me, none of this is going to happen. And here it's all happening so quickly. Immediately the Egyptians vote in, as Andy pointed out, 77% of Egyptians voted for constitutional changes that would marginalize the Christians even further and keep them out of the government and pave the way for the Brotherhood to take over. So what happened to our wonderful secular pluralistic democratic revolution? The problem that we have in the Islamic world is not from Western non-Muslims demonizing Muhammad. For example, Dr. Jasser mentioned in passing at the end of his remarks a minute ago about Muhammad being a pedophile, and the record is clear. Whether you say, well, that hadith is garbage that says Muhammad consummated his marriage with the 9-year-old, well, okay, maybe it's garbage, but the Ayatollah Khomeini, when he took power in Iran, lowered the legal marriageable age of girls to 9 in imitation of the Prophet. He didn't think it was garbage, and he didn't have any significant opposition in Iran when he did that. In Afghanistan, when the aid workers went into with the refugee camps after the Taliban was toppled in 2003, they found half the second grade age girls were already married, and all the girls older than that were already married, in imitation of Muhammad. So the question is, we have to assess this problem realistically. The tendency right now is all going in the other direction. I certainly hope there can be reform in Islam. I certainly hope there can be an opening in liberalism and Hayek's Road to Serfdom in Arabic and so on. But actually, the Arabic language is noted for having the fewest translations from Western languages into Arabic every year. And there is a great closed nature to these societies, and this is going hand in hand with this Islamic resurgence. So I would love to see it all happen, but just to say that it should happen and that it ought to happen is not saying it's going to happen, and we have to assess the problem realistically.
I'm getting a high sign, unfortunately. We could probably go on forever, but we're done. Ladies and gentlemen, Zuhdi Jasser and Robert Smith.